Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today. We've been getting all kinds of questions this time of year about soil tests and how to do it, how to interpret them. So we're going to discuss soil testing today. We could probably dive deeper into this, and we have a couple other podcasts from years prior. We can put links of those in there. We'll actually talk with Dwayne Friend, a very common guest here on the show, about soil testing and soil test interpretation. But I'm not going to do this by myself. I am joined, as always, every week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hey, Ken.
Hello, Chris. How are you doing?
I am doing great. How are things going in Jacksonville?
Very good. It's getting warm and gross, but other than that, finally got the ceilings outside to start hardening them off now that it's stopped having 50-mile-an-hour winds every day and stuff. So
yeah, well, oh yeah, Macomb, we had 60-some-mile-per-hour wind that came through this weekend, and so there's a lot of cleanup happening right now, and all my potted plants wound up on the opposite side of the yard. So, but they're all a-okay. They're getting nursed back to health. But yeah, we had quite a wind this last weekend. So, and lots of rain. Yeah. So been busy cleaning up and getting things put back in shape.
Yep, we didn't have too much damage, really any in our yard. I think we were out of town this weekend, looking at the radar. It seemed like everything started developing a couple miles east of Jacksonville. I think Springfield got hit pretty hard, but Jacksonville, we didn't get anything until early in the morning.
Yeah, we weren't quite sure what was happening. We kept getting these warnings on our phone and everything, and then everything cleared off. We saw blue sky. We ate dinner, getting ready for bed, and then all of a sudden tornado sirens go off, and we're like, we thought it was over, and that's when the big winds hit. So we weren't expecting it, but I know people had forecasted it. So yeah, and so today I am actually covered in soil, and this seems appropriate that we're talking soil testing. I've been pulling T-posts out of the ground because this is a great time to do it right after a big heavy rain. You just wiggle them out of the ground and they come on up. Here in the McDonough County Extension Office, we have a debris or a refuse pile. Our master gardeners, they throw stuff from the garden in there, and we need to do something with it and get it out of here. And so we had to pull up the stakes that held the walls of it up. So that was my morning today, and I just wish I had some type of wood chipper to help me take care of all this debris. So in light of that, Ken, I think it's the time of the year where we check in. How's Ken's wood chipper doing this year?
I used it a couple weeks ago to get some leaves shredded that we left outside in bags over the winter. So, the top 3/4 of it was nice and dry, and the bottom was nice and swampy and gross. But I don't think I killed it. Dumped it in the bags with water and stuff. So last I checked, it's still working.
Well, good. Well, we're hoping Ken's wood chipper will make it through another season. And Chris's wood chipper still has yet to show up at his doorstep, but he's shopping. So yeah, he's tired of all these sticks just building up, and I'd love to do something with them. So I'm looking forward to that.
Build a fire.
Yeah, well, we do lots of fires, and it doesn't make much of a dent. There's a lot of wood out there. Oh my goodness. And now that we've been cutting honeysuckle out of the woods in the back area, honeysuckle is not too bad of a firewood, I'll say that much, but it does take a while for it to dry down in order for it to burn, because it's pretty green. Well, Ken, today we're talking about soil testing, soil test interpretation, and we're really just sharing some of these really common questions that have been coming in. Some of these questions are specifically from homeowners that have reached out to us about soil testing and kind of figuring out the results of these tests. So Ken, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off this week with our first question, please.
The first one is, I went to get my soil tested. Where do I send it or take it? It's probably the most common question we get.
It is. And it's interesting that it's commonly asked to people at the extension, because U of I Extension used to accept soil tests, or we would send them off to campus for testing. But we don't do that anymore. Many reasons why, mostly because it doesn't cost that much to do a soil test, and the price does not really equate to having a full-time person on staff to handle that. And so it was kind of a, wasn't a service being utilized that much. Plus, a lot of people saw extension as being competitive with the commercial labs out there. And so we decided to not do soil tests anymore, but we are happy to advise people on where to send them and then interpretation after the fact. So we will throw in a link into the chat box, and maybe if you're watching this on YouTube, up on the screen here of our there it is, this magic. We're going to make this appear right here with magic and editing. It is actually going to be at extension.illinois.edu/soil. So extension.illinois.edu/soil. That is going to take you to our website that we have more recently put up, that is your one-stop shop for soils, including not only soil testing, but soil management, conservation, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of information on soils there, but you will see that there will be links that you can click on about soil testing. This is going to take you to a web page that will take you to another web page that lists commercial soil labs. Now, commercial soil labs, they go through a whole certification process that is managed by, let's see, it's the American, I'd have to look it up, it's ALTA, American Laboratory Testing Association.
I can see their logo, but I can't.
Yep. So it will take you to the ALTA website, of which these are commercial labs in Illinois or in surrounding states that you will send your sample off to. You'll pay a lab fee and then shipping fees. And the other thing that's also on the extension site is, so if you go back to the extension site, is there a listing of land-grant universities that still do accept soil testing. And these are specifically ones in the Midwest. It's really ideal when you're testing or submitting a sample for a soil test to submit it in a region that has similar soil to yours. You don't necessarily want to send it down to Florida because they grow in sand down there. So you really, because they're going to use soil testing techniques more applicable to the soils in your region. So Midwest, that's really what we try to target here in Illinois.
Yeah, because there are several different tests that can be done on soils, and those interpretations will vary depending on the test, whether you're doing Bray or Malick or any of those others that are out there.
I think Ken just spoke Latin. I don't know what he just said. But yes, those are the tests named after the scientists.
Soil testing class in grade school.
That was a deep pull right there, Ken. Yeah. Those are the soil tests named after the scientists that developed them, more than likely. So, but yeah, we gotta try to stick to your region. I always say call them ahead to get any information about how do they want the soil test collected, and that would be a great idea. We also do have a video done by Dwayne and edited here by Ken, which I found out the other day, about how to collect a soil sample. So we'll throw that link also in the chat description. We've got a lot of links today. There's a lot of information about soils. It's very important. So Ken, you mentioned all these different types of tests, but the other decisions that we have to make when submitting a soil test is like what type of test. Like there's add-ons, there's add-ons, and like when you're buying a plane ticket or something, you can add on to things and stuff. So when it comes to soil testing, what type of test should you get in terms of all the other add-ons to that?
And so I think for most homeowners, most people doing a garden, your basic test is probably going to be good enough, and that's going to get your major stuff that you're going to need. There's also, you can do micronutrients, so get some of those, manganese, iron, calcium, even though that's not really micro. But some of those nutrients we don't need as much of, that typically aren't going to be an issue. But you could do that if you suspect maybe you've got a deficiency in one of those. Heavy metals, you can send samples off to test for heavy metals, lead, things like that. So, if you're living lead's usually more of a concern in more urban areas because of leaded gasoline and that those deposits with more people, more cars, you have more of that lead in the atmosphere or in those areas. Probably around if you have an older house, it was a pre-1970s, there's lead in paint. So if you're living in an older house and you're planting particularly a vegetable garden, probably close to a home, that may be a good idea to see if there's a lot of lead in the soil and if you would need to take any necessary actions because you have elevated lead levels. But those are kind of the two biggies, kind of add-ons would be the micronutrients or heavy metals. But for most people, just your basic test should be enough.
Yeah. And I'll add another. Now, most people might be dealing with the urban situation or an older home situation. Very rarely, but it has happened to me. Somebody built a home in an old orchard, and the chemicals that they used to spray in orchards, long time ago, are gnarly. Lead, arsenic, all kinds of wonderful things that just persist in the soil. And so when they were talking about that, they were showing me, look at these beautiful apple trees, and there was just rows and rows and rows of these old, probably 100-year-old apples. And I'm like, ooh, probably want to get your soil tested before you begin building that garden right there. Because really the main risk is with some of the soil contaminants, not that the plant's going to necessarily absorb those heavy metals and you eat the fruit. It's more of you getting it on your skin or you inhaling the dust from working in that. That's the main concern when it comes to those heavy metals. And so we probably don't know enough to know how much of that stuff plants take up. That would probably require millions of dollars of research to investigate every single plant, because every plant is different. But for the most part, we don't see that stuff moving into the fruit of a plant.
Yeah, and one other thing should have mentioned is when you're doing a test, make sure you're specifying that it is for a lawn or garden.
Yeah.
So you're not finding out how to grow however many bushel corn and beans, because for most soil testing places in the Midwest, focuses are going to be on agronomic crops. They'll do, I think on the website, they indicate whether or not they take home samples, but you need to indicate that you have a home sample. Otherwise, the recommendations you're getting are not necessarily going to match up with what you're trying to grow.
Yes. An annual crop like corn, industrial, we'll say corn and soybeans, is way different than growing even an annual crop like a tomato in the vegetable garden. So 2 different types of crops, 2 very different systems. So, Ken, I forgot too about when it comes to where can you send it or take it. This really does depend on your locality, but sometimes your local FS, your local Farm Bureau, your local soil and water, sometimes you can take soil samples to them and they will send it off. Basically, they're just acting as a middleman there, and they're going to take your sample and just send it off to one of those commercial labs that are listed on Alta. And so you can just call ahead and see if they do that. I guess it saves you a trip to the post office. But also means you have to use whatever service they choose. And so you kind of lose some choice there. So yeah, but again, we'll leave a link below to that soil testing lab listing page for extension, so you can review and kind of make those best choices in terms of labs. And then also a lot of those add-ons that are included.
All right. So they mentioned basic soil test, but I didn't say what was in there. So what does that basic soil test include?
Well, it's a lot of information, and I think that's why a lot of times extension folks will say, do a soil test. I mean, we say that a lot when we're giving classes, like, do a soil test. And there's sometimes that message might get carried away a little bit. Someone's talking about something that might be totally unrelated to soils, like, I got a wasp nest in my tree, do a soil test. I'm like, whoa, hang on, we'll walk that back a little bit, but we do say it a lot. But it contains so much information. I think it's vital for a lot of gardeners, because most of the time we're guessing when it comes to soils. If you don't have a test or results in your hand, you're looking at this, what's the neighbor doing? They're putting this on, I'm going to do this. A lot of times where we're at in Illinois is what's the farmers doing. I see a lot of that where like, well, the farmers are doing this now. They're putting lime on their field, or they're putting fertilizer on there. And they're like, well, I'm going to do that. Like, but do you need to? That's the big question, is like cost and saving money. So I'd say a key thing, first thing on a soil test is it's going to tell you your soil's organic matter content. Now, this is going to be represented as a percentage. Where we're at in Illinois, central Illinois, I'll say, we have soils high in organic matter. And a lot of times people be like, oh, what, like 50%? Like, well, not that high. That's like compost practically. But a high soil organic matter is something anywhere from like 6 to 8%. Said that when the prairies were turned over, a lot of that was close to 8 to 10% soil organic matter. On an average across the state of Illinois, you can lose soil organic matter. We've gone down to about 4 to 6% on average across the whole state, 4 to 6% soil organic matter, which is still great compared to a lot of other states and a lot of other countries across the planet. So it will tell you your soil organic matter, which can also tell you about your tilth. And it can also tell you about some of that nutrient load that organic matter can hold on to, which we'll probably talk more about that nutrient load here in a little bit. But next, Ken, what else does our basic soil test tell us?
If people aren't sure what organic matter is, that's like your former living stuff, your plant material, and a lot of that's going to be stable, break down slowly, and release nutrients over time. So it's a good thing to have. It's like a fertilizer almost. It gives you nutrients.
Oh, and I misspoke. Average soil organic matter across the state is 2 to 4%. Sorry, I glanced at my notes, and so right now, average soil organic matter 2 to 4% throughout the state. It will vary depending on your location. All right,
Yes.
What's next, Ken, on our basic soil test list here?
pH will be another thing on there. So basically, how acidic or alkaline your soil is. So pH scales from 0 to 14, 7 being neutral. So anything above 7 is going to be alkaline or basic. Anything below is going to be acidic. Most of the plants we're growing in our gardens are going to like it slightly acidic, 6.3 to 7. If you're growing things like blueberries, that's going to be even lower into the 5s. So, let's say for most of our crops and our soils in Illinois, pH is going to be fine. If we're going to grow blueberries, you're going to have to adjust the pH more than likely. For generally speaking, for Illinois, there may be spots where you wouldn't have to. If your pH does need to be adjusted, typically ours is probably going to be a little higher than low. So we'd be adding, if you need to lower it, you're going to be adding sulfur a lot of times. If you need to raise your pH, you're going to be doing a lime product more than likely. And if you're getting an interpretation with the results, it should say add this much sulfur or lime to your soils to get down to the appropriate levels.
And that pH, we try to adjust it, but nature usually, like, if you do adjust it downward, just nature oftentimes over time will flip it back to where it was before. So it's usually a continual fight.
Yeah, and that pH level the pH is going to, nutrient availability will depend on pH. So as the soil pH changes, certain elements, certain nutrients are going to become more or less available. So there's charts online that you can find. Usually bands, they'll get narrower or wider depending on what the pH is. So that's why we want that 6.3 to 7, because most nutrients in the soil, elements in the soil, that's going to be where they're most available. You start getting higher, you start losing some. You start getting lower, they become less available, and then that's when plants start struggling, is because they can't get some of those essential nutrients because they're not as available because of the pH.
The telltale example of that is pin oak in Illinois. What often happens is you see the tissue begins to yellow and the veins stay green. That's called interveinal chlorosis or iron chlorosis. Now, a lot of folks initially say, well, that means I don't have enough iron in my soil. But no, it's actually a pH problem, where your pH is in an area where your pin oak cannot take up that iron. So you might have all the iron in the world in your soil, But if the pH is wrong, that plant cannot take up that nutrient. And what you think is an iron problem is usually a pH problem.
What's something else that we'll get in? It probably affects nutrient levels there.
Ken, I was hoping you weren't going to ask because I don't really understand it. But cation exchange capacity is also known as CEC. I just remember in soils class, this is the time where I'm like, whoa, we're getting so deep right here into the weeds. But essentially what cation exchange capacity is it is a measurement of how well soil particles hold on to nutrients. So there's soil particles like clay, sand, silt, and then of course we have our organic matter. So the sand, silt, and clay, those are mineral particles. They don't go away. Organic matter, as we already stated, that can go away over time. But the sand, silt, and clay, they're categorized based on their size and shape, really. Sand is the biggest one. You've seen sand. You can you can hold sand in your hand and actually see the particles in your hand. Silt, it's kind of in between. It's that really kind of filmy, fine textured material. And then we have our clay, which is even more just like silky smooth. And that is the smallest particle size. So like in a tablespoon, you can hold, so many grains of sand, but that same tablespoon will hold an exponentially greater amount of clay because clay is so much smaller. Clay also is flat, like plates. And people watching that can see me putting my hands on top of each other. If you're listening, just imagine that. So clay particles are actually flat like plates, and they're teeny tiny, and they're negatively charged. All of that combines to the fact that clay holds the most nutrients. Another great thing about our soils, you say like, clay soils are bad, but actually the right ratio, clay, organic matter, sand, and silt, actually clay is good because it can hold nutrients that your plants can then access through their root systems. So CEC is going to be a measurement of those nutrients being held by that soil. And so when we look at the ideal CEC, soils that have one CEC with a 15 to 20 measurement, that's pretty good for soil nutrition. Now, anything with 6 or lower, you're going to probably need to be looking at some type of a nutrient management or amendment to go in that soil. A lot of times we see deficiencies like potassium in low CEC soils. So we're talking sandy soils or soils low in organic matter, that we typically have these low CEC rates. So that just kind of a situation where we might need to be adding some fertilizers, organic matter, mulch, things like that. So that sounded like a big muddy mess that came out of my mouth, but CEC is a measurement of the nutrients your soil can hold, and 15 to 20, that's the window that we like to hit. Ken, are there any other things that our basic soil tests can tell us?
But really kind of one other thing is going to be your macronutrients. So typically they're not going to test for nitrogen because that's going to fluctuate in the soil depending on the time of year and amount of moisture and all this, that, and the other, because it's a lot of times it's coming from the organic matter, and there's really no good way to, it's just basically a little snapshot of that time. So typically your soil test is going to recommend, you put down this much nitrogen depending on the crops you're growing, because it's just going to vary from time to time. So when you get your soil test, you'll have, a number on there, and it'll say, is it very low, low, high, proper, whatever it is. We want to pay attention to that. If you've got high levels, you probably don't want to be putting any extra phosphorus on there. So you get too much phosphorus on there, that can potentially inhibit uptake of other nutrients. You get too much on there, it can wash off, get into bodies of water, then you get algal blooms. It's one of the reasons why we've got issues in the Gulf, just because of excess fertilizers and stuff going down. Phosphorus being one of those that can cause those algal blooms. Other thing that's going to be on there for sure is going to be potassium, or K, and that's that third number on that fertilizer bag. And again, it's going to tell you do you have adequate, is it low, is it high, and then we'll give you recommendations based on that. This is how many pounds of phosphorus or potassium you should be applying to get adequate nutrients in your soil for plant growth.
That's why they put out the Illinois phosphorus law, which is states across the United States have sort of across the board not really ban phosphorus, but they are restricting the use of phosphorus for things like lawn applications. And so when the three numbers that you see on those fertilizer bags, the NPK, you can go into a garden center now, and the middle number, the phosphorus, is 0 sometimes. That's for those situations where you really just are focusing on that nitrogen application, and maybe a little bit of potassium in there. That 0 for that phosphorus is because, as Ken mentioned, it can run off, it can contaminate waterways. It binds to soil. And when we have erosion, or when we have those gully washers, it goes with that soil into our waterways. But the other reason that it binds with soil, phosphorus doesn't leave, doesn't leach out. So we see these excessive amounts of phosphorus begin to build in Illinois soils. And so typically, when someone says they got a deficiency in phosphorus or potassium, I think, what kind of raised bed are they growing in? Because it doesn't sound like they're growing in Illinois soils. So it's usually a kind of a artificial or some type of soil mixture that they've created for their garden.
And I'd say, for that phosphorus stuff, a lot of times it's farmers that get vilified because they're to blame for all this phosphorus, but a good chunk of that's coming from residential areas to lawn applications that get into storm sewers and then flowing into rivers and stuff too.
Yeah.
So it's not just the farmers doing it.
Yep. A lot of the farmers, they take classes and things, leave a buffer from waterways, and many of them are very conscious of the fact that we have to protect our water. Homeowners don't have to do that. They can go to the store, they can buy a bag of fertilizer, spread it right around the pond if their house is next to a pond, if they want to, or a creek or a stream, and they don't have to take a class that instructs them proper methods. And so all we can extension say is read that label. Apply according to that label, leave a buffer around waterways too, if you can. Well, not if you can. I don't use the word should very often, but you really should.
One of the few times.
No, it's one of the few times I'll whip that out.
All right. So now that we know what we're getting on our soil test. So soil test shows I'm low in nitrogen and potassium. What fertilizers could we use that's going to contain potassium?
Well, Ken, as you mentioned, be careful of soil tests that are like you're low on nitrogen, because as Ken had said, that's not an accurate measurement of nitrogen at a time. It is just a snapshot in that year. Nitrogen gets released all of the time. And then especially in the summer, a lot of soil testing companies just assume there's going to be a nitrogen deficiency because everything is growing, everything is alive, and everything is using nitrogen. Plants, micronutrients, microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, they're all in the soil using nitrogen. So they kind of assume there's going to be a deficiency in your soils. That's why we always just sort of see that knee-jerk nitrogen recommendation for a lot of our soil tests. So that's kind of that. If you have a soil test saying you have a nitrogen deficiency, that's usually why. If they're trying to give you an actual measurement, just take that with a grain of salt. Again, it's a snapshot in time. Nitrogen levels change in the soil all the time. So potassium, you have a deficiency in potassium. And then I would ask, are you growing in a raised bed, or where are you? Maybe you're in Mason County, Illinois, which is mostly sand. And that I think was the case here. They had a high sandy soil. I don't think they were in Mason County, but they had a high sand content soil, and they're trying to figure out how to add potassium back into there. That can be a little difficult to find like a singular thing that only contains potassium. I'd say if you want to go kind of with the shotgun approach, compost or a composted manures, they give you a lot of those macro and micronutrients. So that would be maybe the first approach to take. After that, there are a few things you could look for. Bags in the store labeled potash, which is just kind of another name for potassium. The other thing is one that I see used quite a bit is a product called green sand. I know that adds potassium. I don't know. I've never used it myself, but I've seen that inputted in a lot of different like homemade potting soil mixtures is green sand. But for the most part, I would look at kind of those more organic based fertilizers composted manures or yard waste compost to add some of those macro and micronutrients to your yard, or look for bags labeled with potash or green sand. All right, Ken. So our last question for today is this person had soil testing on their garden and it said that they need to add magnesium. Do you have any suggestions on what to add or the best way to go about adding magnesium to the soil?
So there's two kind of common ways we're going to do that. One is going to be dolomitic limestone. I guess kind of the drawback of that is that it's got it'll alter pH, raise the pH of the soil. So that may be something you need to be careful about. If your pH is already running a little bit high, that may not be the best option because you don't want to get that pH too high. But if it's within the acceptable range, that may be something you could apply. Another one that commonly be used and easily found is going to be magnesium sulfate, better known as Epsom salts. So that would be a source of magnesium.
Ken can't believe the words coming out of his mouth right now. It's recommending Epsom salts.
Magnesium, and you get some sulfur in there.
There you go.
And despite all the internet miracle cures, that's probably one of the few things that's good for in the garden anyway. Soak your feet in it when you're done. But that could be a source of magnesium as well. So those would be probably the two primary ways you're going to get those.
Well, that was a lot of great information about soil testing, how to do it, where to send it, and a little bit about some of those interpretation of the results. The Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited. I'll edit that out maybe. This week by me, Chris Enroth. Special thank you to Ken for hanging at me. Ken, I can't do this anymore. I think it's time to go outside. It's a beautiful day out, but thank you for hanging out with me and chatting about soil testing and answering these questions today.
Hey, thank you for hanging out too, and may have to go get me a soil test here and figure out what's going on in the garden.
It's just Ken's garden is everything good. I think I've seen it once or twice and it's a paradise. So whatever he's doing that soil, it's working.
This is not a paradise right now. Lots of work.
Oh boy. Yeah.
And let's do this again next week.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. We are going to have guest Ryan Pankow on. And he's a horticulture educator over in Champaign. And we are going to be unveiling a brand new website that we've been working on for, Ken, how many years? Long time.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. But we finally have this website done, and we're excited to showcase this off to the folks of Illinois, US, Midwest, the world, whoever. So hint, it's about bugs. Hint, Ken's favorite topic here. So we are going to be kicking that website off on the Good Growing Podcast next week with Ryan Pankow. So we look forward to having you back here then. So listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing.